1, 2, 3. Welcome everyone to Header Footer Presents, the New Media Caucus's podcast. I'm your host, Constanza. In this episode, I have the pleasure of presenting our two special guests, both art historians and curators working across contemporary Latin American art and new media, Sara Garzón and Julio García Murillo. Sara Garzón is a curator and art historian. Her scholarship on decoloniality, temporality, and eco-criticism develops critical frameworks that illuminate histories of resistance, knowledge exchange, and transnational networks of artistic solidarity. Currently, Sara is Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at the Harn Museum of Art, where she is committed to expanding the representation of Indigenous and Latinx artists, particularly in the field of new media art. She is also serving as curator of the 2027 Bienal de Medellín, and before that, co-curated the second Bienal de Amazonias 2025. She has worked on exhibitions internationally and led different research initiatives such as South to South, a meeting on African and Afro-diasporic technologies from 23 to 20, with support from the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and the Rise of Coyote, a school of art and technology in Mexico City, organized by Materia Abierta from 22, and Julio García Murillo is an art historian curator based in Mexico City. His work explores the intersections of curatorial research, critical and art writing, and public programming, with a particular focus on recent history and radical contemporary practices. He is currently Deputy Director of Public Programs at the Museo Universitario Arte Contemporáneo, where he oversees academic, pedagogical, and sound-based initiatives. His projects include co-organizing the conferences Stories of the Blue Night, Sami Purepecha, and Ayuk Art and Culture Forum, Digital Museum Intelligences and Artifices, and Unlearning the Modern from Tate and Moag 2022. He also coordinated the children's book Tomar el Museo y Otros Espacios, and was writer and narrator of Gran Hotel Avis, a podcast on critical theory and contemporary art. He is currently co-curating an exhibition at Moag focused on the experimental and politically engaged collectives that emerged in Mexico during the 1970s. So this podcast episode was born out of recent conversations with our guests about the role of museums, how they navigate engagement with AI technologies, and other questions that came up are also, how do we build community with our audiences? How are museums civic and pedagogical spaces? And how might we consider museums even as laboratories? So welcome, Sara and Julio.
Hello, Constanza. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Hi, Constanza. Hello.
Hello. So to get us started, I think we should discuss a particular essay that Sara brought up. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that informed some of the conversations that we've been talking about, including museums, policies, engagement with AI technologies, etc.?
Towards the end of April, I attended the conference. This is the American Alliance of Museum Curators. And we met in New York to discuss a variety of topics of interest that are facing our museum kind of cultures and world institutions among colleagues. And the last panel of that gathering was moderated by the director of the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, Randall Suffolk, who moderated and introduced the panel based on an article that he wrote last year and the topic of AI in museums, titled "The Real AI Challenge for Museums Isn't Tech Itself, but Time." And the piece really gained a lot of commentary. And so it was a wonderful experience to be able to rehash some of the things that he spells out in this article and discuss that among colleagues who are facing very similar challenges or thinking about technology at large and new media, our practices, but also the changing kind of landscape that these studies in technology are having for museums. So in the article and throughout the panel, I think for me, the one thing that really stood out from the larger implications of AI was the fact that, as he says, artificial intelligence has a particular kind of quiet power. And that is the fact that it's helping us rethink institutions. So while we may be thinking about AI policies within the museum, or we're thinking also some of the work that I'm doing here at the Harn Museum of Art is about building collections, expands on new media art, really the AI transformation is happening at a much bigger kind of level. And that is the ways in which it raises questions around the relevancy of museums in the 21st century, and of course, its continuous transformation within our societies. So just to maybe get started, I would love to read one quote from this article that I thought was the most relevant, even though there's so much here to be unpacked. And he writes, "As museums and audiences become more agile and efficient thanks to these tools, AI tools, we are afforded something rare, the capacity to rethink how we use our time, our space, and social capital. That transformation opens the door to a more profound question for us within museums. What kind of public institutions do we want to be when this societal landscape shifts? So that really left me thinking, and this is also why I was so appreciative of your invitation, Constanza, to talk with Julio and hopefully more as we joined this revolution to think about really the stakes of the work that we do as institutions when it comes to facing some of these technological shifts.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. It's very informative article. And I think what I'm going to do is put it in a link in our podcast episode as we air it as well. There is something to be said in terms of what can museums do, what is a changing role of museums as institutions, of course. But there is something also that Julio also said in our conversations. How can we think of the museum as a laboratory, for instance? That's something that stood out to me. So I was wondering if you could maybe reflect back on what Sara was introducing, but also entangle or disentangle, I should say, right? What does it mean for a museum to be a laboratory today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Constanza. And I think that obviously the introduction that Sara is making open up a lot of issues and problems that in a way are elaborated or articulated inside a museum program through different perspectives. What I think is that it, as you said, mixes or entangle different ways of understanding the digital world and different transformations that are just not in terms of quantity, but are qualitative as well. There's a complete different understanding on how, for example, just 10 years ago, we were making ourselves the questions about digital world regarding the access, for example, the access for collections in the museums. How do you make visible your connection and that the audience can be able to access, to study from it, through a web page, for example? But the pandemics changed completely the panorama because one question had to do with research that Sara is familiar to. How can we understand that the contemporary digital world work in a similar way of extraction as colonialism? How, for example, the problems of data grab started to happen, how the problem was not the access, but the asymmetries in the access, how the problems were not the freedom utopia about the digital world, but specifically how corporatives were, these big tech corporations were actually getting rich with their behavior, with their digital behavior. The question from access, I think that it was displaced to citizenship during the how to engage in civic ways of understanding and community building. And now we are in a different moment as well that charges the access as well as the citizenship or the civic understanding of digital world through the notion or through the transformations of digital world with artificial intelligence. And there is where I was pointing out something that in the museum, in the MUAC, we elaborated in a project curated by curator and scholar José Carlos Mariátegui from Peru. And he was really looking into how we can understand how we can disentangle the notion or separate in a sort of analytical and explorative way the intelligence and the artificial. How can we understand with these sorts of, or with this repertoire of intelligence, how can we figure out different ways of understanding intelligence, different beings being intelligent and different machines being intelligent as well in a human, non-human ecosystem, how non-Western thought engages in a way, and how the museum, the contemporary museum, can be a laboratory to put these questions to a broader audience and to actually elaborate from an artistic perspective different ways of feeling, hearing, and seeing. So the laboratory could be starting these sorts of conversations in the museum, but obviously playing through a exhibition and programming way.
Very pedagogical, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. You mentioned something that I wanted to put stress on, which is these mechanisms, or you're hinting towards this belief of neutrality of technology, right? And of course, there you can also extend that to the presumed neutrality that sometimes institutions hold. But if we think about institutions as pedagogical spaces where we build community, right, and laboratories like you were also suggesting, then we can potentially build spaces within places that have been historically used for oppression, either institutional, geographical, regional as well, right? And who needs it the most? Places of critique within places of oppression is what comes to mind. The other thing to note, as well as our changing landscape with AI technologies, is also, Sara, something that we've been talking about at your institution, where they are implementing a lot of, there's this excitement for AI technologies and in implementing them in different departments. So how does your museum engage with this transformation at your institutional level?
That's a wonderful question. And I do think it goes back to what Julio was saying, that I think is the biggest challenge. But the things that we are not all, or not at every level within the institution, both at the museum institution, but also the university institution level, are fully understanding. Just to clarify, the Hart Museum of Art is the museum of the University of Florida. So we are very closely interfacing and engaging with our academic community. While the university has been for a few years now investing millions of dollars in making University of Florida, which is the flagship university of the state, the kind of center of AI research by placing experts across different fields, both in the humanities, social sciences, and of course the sciences. Again, moving beyond the silo of technologies only for the tech sector, but really making sure that every field is up to date with these transformations. And so when I first came into this position, I was asked to not only broaden the collection, but specifically build the collection of new media art. I thought it was a very important and relevant moment to do, right? Because our audiences, students and academics, but also beyond that, the citizens of the city of Gainesville, are all, as much as anyone else in the world and in the US specifically, facing this kind of enthusiasm for these new technologies. Is really important for us to, as an institution, provide historical precedents that build on an understandings of who really were the forefront of these technologies in the early 20th century, not just now. So dismantling this idea that the new media technologies are new is the first challenge, and there's many that follow after that. But before I get to that, I would like to respond to Julio's point about the construction of citizenship, because I do think that's exactly the thing that most of our institutional makers are not necessarily aware of, or they continue to undermine, which is the belief that technology is really a cultural product in itself. We are a society building these technologies. It's not the museum that is art or the academic fields are charged to continue to think of technology as separate, external, as a tool that we use. So institutionally, many of our conversations remained in thinking about these technologies as, oh, did we adapt a policy for media art? Are we using ChatGPT to write or edit or think about emails, right? We're using them as tools, as editors, as data sense-making software, as external to our users. How do we incorporate our day-to-day? How do we introduce technology as this thing that we just want to observe and analyze its evolution, but not really thinking of it as something that we are all now completely embedded in, completely constructing and helping to build. So when you bring the question of big tech, that is, I think, at the core of many of the questions that we should be raising, but we're not there yet, which is also how all of this is becoming a cultural product or a political product that makes a museum ever more relevant precisely because of its civic duties to hold this abstraction, which is technology, and materialize it in ways where people can actually see themselves as contributors. So in this kind of technological revolutions that we're witnessing in terms of how it's changing the role of the museum, it is not just about making more exhibitions or building broader collections or even upgrading our policies for conservation and integration of media art and media technologies overall, but it's really about how do we create the spaces for thinking critically about how we have all become technologized and how we contribute to those technological revolutions to the degree of inequality, as Julio was observing. We have to contend with this kind of contradictory reality where we recognize the importance of these technologies and to the history of art. We recognize its importance to our capacity to be, quote unquote, more efficient within our day-to-day jobs. But then you're building data centers, right, in our land. that are depleting our communities from water, or people are being dispossessed by the same engagement that they have to those technologies, right? Via the techno-gratification of our lives, where people are dispossessed from their rights of owning the technologies that they are feeding through their behavior online. And just in closing, I just want to say that I find that to be a very interesting kind of parallel, because as Julio was also noting, the evolution of the digital revolution within museums, I think just has a very different kind of language to it, right? Julio, you were describing early on in our first meeting how the first step to this revolution was the digitalization of our collections and putting them online and making sure that people had access to the museum. So this hype of a global audience was built, right? Because allegedly our museums could be online, because our collections could be online. And we created this idea of a planetary kind of audience. That conversation has, of course, evolved to where we feel threatened, our institutions, not just museums, but overall our institutions threatened by this revolution, feeling displaced, feeling that AI can do our jobs, feeling that we're losing a labor battle with big tech and other corporations, and that they're undermining our value as institutions. And yet it seems to me that the reverse is true, right? That in the end, museums do gain heightened relevancy precisely, and maybe only if we were to actually reframe the question of technology as not something that we need to analyze externally, but help make sense of internally, right? How it is and how are we all technologizing our reality? How are we all contributing as a society to those transformations and not just being bulldozed by them? So I don't know, I just want to stop there, but I do think that the role of the museum civically is something that institutionally we're still not really that aware of, ironically.
Julio, do you have a response by any chance before I get into this?
And yeah, I don't know. I think that we are exploring as well here in this conversation, but I was remembering now how what the first experience in museums was not just putting the collections online, but I don't know if you remember this sort of digital tours or virtual tours in which the museum space tour was completely displaced as a spatial experience, more closer to a video game than to I don't know, than to a content-based product. And now we are displaced to this other way of producing or generating ideas through a specific methodologies of content. What I mean by this is we are able to know that we create this or that for digital media, that we can elaborate more complex ideas in podcasts or others or other formats. And I think that one thing that we can use a museum to is being aware of the side products that we generate while we produce these contents. And what do I mean by this? Where does the data goes and what supports the data? How it affects water consumption and in the global south? But following the actual thread is something that the big tech companies ain't gonna do. It's something that probably the government departments ain't gonna do as well. It's something that the museums can actually do and generate an experience in order to understand where it is going. And many artists do that as well. They follow the leads in order to understand what happens when we put enter into a easy or bureaucratic task for a chat.
Yes, following the thread, I think, is not only very important, but it's a responsibility, right? That many artists have engagement. One of them that comes to mind is Kate Crawford, who herself is not an artist, but she is a writer of the Atlas of AI. And she's worked with Trevor Palin to create a schemata, actually, of the different threads where AI technologies stem from, how they are created, and digital technologies in general, right? I often talk about the levels of abstraction that exist with digital technologies, AI included, right? And we do not consider the infrastructures that lie within, the extraction that lies within, right? The exploitation of labor that, for example, also lies within in different parts of the world. But we have this idea of data centers, and how do we negotiate them, or how do we contrast them with something like sustainability, right, within an institutional level, right? Again, the levels of abstraction are very difficult sometimes to comprehend. But then that gets me to the question of expertise, right? You're both curators and art historians. How do we reevaluate expertise in an era in which we rely to a greater extent with AI technologies or to AI technologies? When do they become a crutch, and when should we think about expertise as something not just like 18th century, 17th century, but something that is even more relevant today?
I like that question because I feel like it's not even a question of this particular complexity or intersection of things, which is AI and museums and expertise, but of museums throughout. And because museums, and I would love to hear what Julio has to say about this, working with academic and discursive programming at WAG. Museums and as curators, we're also charged constantly to, of course, assume the non-expertise of our audiences. So we're speaking to non-expert audiences, and we as experts have to make this huge leap in making, translating art historical content and value to our general audiences who come to the museums with a very distinct set of expectations, of course, knowledge frameworks, many of which have often little to do with necessarily building expertise. What I mean by that is audiences often come to the museum for sociability. They hang out with family or friends. They see the museums as a destination for being together. And the artwork often takes a secondary role in that, right? They don't come to the museum, or not always, to become experts in any one field. They want to know more about art. They're intrigued about the artist. They love to hear these quirky biographical elements of artists because, again, the artist holds a very powerful and intriguing imaginary within the, again, imagination of our audiences, right? There's eccentrics or revolutionaries, and they always think outside the box, and people who are not themselves artists or are in the art world love to hear, I think, about those stories, about those kinds of figures and the kinds of people that make art and have creative lives. So it's interesting to think about the question of expertise within the museum context when that is very fungible. What do we mean by expertise? How do we translate? How do we organize things from an expert perspective and to deliver something that is feeding a very different set of expectations? That's not to undermine the importance of it, but there's also a historical trajectory to that question that AI is for sure repositioning because, again, people have access to a overwhelming amount of information. So there's, I think, the tension between information and expertise, and that people feel that they can access more about the artists. We also know that about our audiences as well. So we don't write long wall text. We don't have long interpretative materials. In fact, I just heard that LACMA, who went through this massive multi-million-dollar renovation in Los Angeles, has 0 labels next to their arcs, right? So there's also been historically a tension between how much information do we give our audiences. A lot of people, when I talk to our docents who do all of our tours, they refuse letting people to read. Reading is this kind of antithetical question to seeing, right? They want people to look, they want people to feel, and somehow reading, disrupts that process. So it's interesting that we're, as artists, in dealing with the art world that is about the sensible, that it is about the visual, often refute the question of information within the galleries as well. But I do think that because we are in an information overload, that the question of expertise does take a slightly different form to help our audiences, one, make sense of all the information, much of which can also be, and is often, incorrect, right? So the information overload is not that AI is replacing experts, is creating confusion, is taking on things without context, is not really historicizing, or is not doing a lot of the things that as human historians can do. So I think it revalidates our role. But also, I think it creates this idea that, and I think this is true, again, if we think about the museum as a laboratory, as a pedagogical, ultimately pedagogical space, where it's not just about what information we deliver, as much as how information is produced, right? How do we, and this is, I think, part of this bigger picture of technology, that is not just about a tool, a system, a structure, an infrastructure. It's really about, I think, an epistemic crisis or an epistemic question of how knowledge is produced and which kind of knowledge is productive or helpful. And I think the museum doesn't have to rival the information overload in order to be relevant, right? It has to be a place where communities can feel like they are contributing to the construction of knowledge, where knowledge is seen as something that is collaborative in the making. One of the things that I've learned through my years of working at museums that for me has been foundational in revitalizing my belief in curatorial work is that in the end, and this also, just as a side anecdote, happened through my experience at the Brooklyn Museum, when at a time, 10 years ago, museums were also quite allergic. They were terrified about the use of cell phones in the galleries because this was the age of the flip phone. The smartphone hadn't been quite popularized, let's say. And people were doing crazy things and breaking objects just to take a selfie. And they were texting, and they were, of course, accessing maybe the first iterations of the web on mobile. And the museums were frightened because, again, that was taking away from looking. The cell phone became this enemy of the museum. So the Brooklyn Museum kind of leaned into that discomfort and built an app, one of the first museum apps called the Ask app. And so I was recruited among some colleagues to build and help build this Ask app. And it's basically having real-time historians answering real-time questions from the collection. And the process was fascinating. It was a bit unsustainable for sure, but it was fascinating in that we were able to test a series of things and assumptions that I think as curators and museum professionals we make about our audiences, all of which were wrong. All of our assumptions in the process of testing and developing this app were proven wrong. And one of the things that really stood out to me about being wrong about audiences was that we often assume that looking is this one-to-one relationship. Object speaks to person, thinks about object, they're having this kind of intimate, psychotic relationship with each other. And that's absolutely untrue. The museum is a social space, and looking is happening always collectively. Even if you're not talking to someone, you're in a space. It's like watching a movie. You're like in the theater. Very similarly, we're all having a very similar experience by looking at objects together. In essence, we end up looking at each other, look at works of art, right? So the looking is not just me and the object, is me looking at other people look at the object. And that collective viewing is, I think, the thing that reasserts this idea that museums are inherently social spaces for collective looking. And everything that in that kind of immateriality of, it could be people talking to each other, but it could also be not people talking to each other and yet sharing space to look at something. That immateriality, that energetic field that is created within that gallery space is what makes a museum a relevant space. So it's interesting, I think, in that, again, I think we can, to some degree, really trust a museum to be a space of collaborative learning and teaching, because there's so many layers into which that form of building knowledge is happening. And I think we often don't even take as much advantage of what that could become when we think about museums having a role of bringing people together to redefine what knowing and what kind of knowledge is relevant, much of which in the age of chronic isolation, people are thirsty and hungry, really, for places of sociability. And so not undermining, I think, that role when it comes to knowledge production is, I think, at the core of one of the things that museums can still do beautifully that AI could never.
This reminds me of, just to go back to what both of you were saying, actually, and what Julio brought up. During the pandemic, it was a very difficult time for many people, especially institutions, art institutions, right? And like you were saying, there was a shift towards VR tours, via headsets, via virtually consuming artwork rather than understanding it. And I appreciate what you were saying, Sara, about this different experience that you had about building this app, right? And about having this live or real-time ability to ask a curator, art historian, expert of sorts. But I wonder, now that I think about all these different things in terms of what is knowledge, right? And especially the content that we consume, what do you think, and this goes for both of you, what is the difference between information is power versus knowledge is power?
I'd like to come back a little bit about what Sara was saying, and it's like how this exercise and experience that she does describe, in a way, remediates or reparates an experience that happened in the second half of the 19th century and in the first of the 20th century. How the notion of criticism was that, not describing the work of art, but describing the behavior and engagement of the general public in front of the work of art. And if we remember Baudelaire texts of the Salon in Paris in the 19th century, that was the way in which he was working. Now, in the transformation on how we understand criticism and critical work inside a gallery and how, in a way, it was displaced to the curatorial work, the museums need, from one way or the other, to make not just representations, but exercises of participation in order to understand that figuring yourself in the middle of the gallery as an audience or as part of a community is important for the functioning of the museum. the actual content of the museum is not the artwork, but the public inside. So I was just thinking how these digital experiences or how the questions and labels trace back different ways of understanding the art, the museums of art and the modern, even though that we agree or disagree, the modern tasks of building them as public places, places in which you can actually elaborate, generate eloquence and criticism as well. And I think that there I can come back to what you were saying, to the question on power. It's a hard and interesting question because there's an asymmetry. And I think that the museums need to work from that asymmetric way of, or that asymmetric condition. We can feel that in how we need resources, we need to generate, how the question on power and art and museums in a way is based in the condition of the asymmetries of the society. How, as Sara was saying, the museum is not an external or neutral or artificial space, but in a way, it's a place in which you can zoom in or zoom out society issues. But I don't know if that was the direction of the question.
I would like to maybe jump in
Yes, please.
before we get to the is information or knowledge where power lies, to also introduce something. I love what you were saying, tracing the history of the museum through the 19th century into the modern project of critical discourse in museums as a public sphere, right? Where we're also rehearsing and even teaching or perhaps indoctrinating audiences to be socially compliant to some degree. I don't want to always cast a negative light on that compliancy, but yes, there is also something very formative about what societies are and do, and how critical thinking within societies and critical behavior and expression is being fostered, but also controlled within our modern project, and how the museum fits into that, delivering some of that desire in building, again, the quote unquote audience as a particular kind of group that knows and understands behavior. So it's conditioned to certain kinds of behavior. But one of the things that I think has evolved in this technological revolution is that it's something that Claire Bishop, in her latest book, Disordered Attention, How We Look at Art and Performance Today, is also bringing up, which is not that museums are, and I think because we can make these cases about technology in museums and social spaces or the social sphere throughout, like you said, the 19th century and into the 20th century. And yet today, one of the most transformative elements of that is the fragmentation of the gaze, the attention disorder that we are living in. So while the history of media technologies has been consistent throughout the 20th century, and I think there's this kind of a funny cartoon from the early 20th century, how people were complaining about how newspapers were disturbing attention and how people could no longer be attentive to their surrounding because they were so consumed in the newspaper, and making that kind of equitable to the ways in which we're caught up always in our smartphones, who are, of course, mining our attention. That fragmentation of the gaze, that radical disordered attention, as Claire Bishop calls it, does have an effect, and it is naturalizing within the galleries, right? So the museum is not only changing because these questions are new, let's say, but they are new because people are able to, and this is something that Claire Bishop herself is saying, become weirdly more, the positive side of this, the silver lining, is that people do somehow become better at non-linearity, right? Not having a linear history makes sense to some of these newer audiences or new ways of looking by the audience because they can contain information. So what I think one of the things that complicates the idea of information/knowledge power is that the information, neither knowledge, are holistic. They come in parts and bits, and they are often contradictory, and they often, I think, internally also struggle to make sense, right? So there is this disordering of information, and there's that disorderly way of looking at information today as well. And I like that. I think that's a speculative place for us to think about, one, giving up ideas, again, the silver lining side of the argument, giving away with ideas of linearity and historicity, and abiding also by modernist ideologies that, again, are built to enhance those discrepancies and those inequalities when it comes to knowledge, access, and so on. But in the other hand, the negative, I think, connotation of some of that fragmentation is that, right, how we are not able really to contain information, retain information, remember things. Our brains as elastic as they are also somewhat, or at least to our preliminary, what is called understandings of brain capacity, losing its capacity. We see this generation, especially the young generation that lives through COVID, but our college students have really demonstrated challenges in learning, right? They have very different ways in which their brains are now operating. And for us, some of us, it translates into a series of delays in their brain development. Someone described it as that college has turned into a kindergarten, where no longer are people not learning, they just even can't sit still, right? It's like dealing with toddlers. Suddenly college professors are asking their students to, just begging them to stay still for an hour. You can be bored. We were all bored when we were in college, but we could sit for an hour or 2 or 3 without moving, right? That's just something that younger audiences can no longer necessarily do. Right. So we're seeing changing behaviors in their incapacity for stillness, and their incapacity to boredom, and their incapacity to retain and process certain kinds of information. So I think there's more and more studies coming up alongside these lines. And so we are dealing with a transformation in our perception and our capacity to process information. So how do we make the museum as a civic space also in some ways respond to, what does information or knowledge mean to people whose brains are, and all of us are changing. I don't think it's just a generation. The technology is doing this to all of us. The attention disorder and the mining of our attention via media is affecting all of us. All of our brains are shifting because of this. So again, we don't have scientific answers for this, but I think, again, it's a speculative way in which can we then become a resource for people who learn differently now that we're not abiding by this sense of linearity, to call it one thing. Can we lean into fragmentation, since visuality is inherently also about a multiplicity, right? And cohesion allegedly would come from also being able to make sense and sustain contradiction, which I think our polarizing societies are no longer also able to do. And one of the great victories, and I hope to end soon, but the victories of technocratic societies that we're dealing with is precisely polarization, right? The cooptation of information, the meddling of our affect through fear-mongering. And that has made our societies increasingly intolerant, fearful, unable to see themselves a part of a whole. This idea of society is also failing. I think going back to those early 20th century examples, where the very ideas of the commons, the very idea of things that we see, the nation or these things don't signify the same things because we don't share or cannot see a common ground with people we don't know, and yet share this abstract idea of nation. So all of the things are also, I think, evolving in this landscape. It's not just the technologies, it's how technologies are weaponized to separate us and fragment us as a society as a whole. So I think the speculative question is, what can museums do to help people contain contradiction and see opposition as generative, as opposed to almost like countering what the techno-capitalism wants our brains to believe?
I think that is amazing what you're saying. Based on the text by Bishop, this attention disorder and nonlinearity, and in a way, the potentiality of thinking from a sort of fragmentary assemblage way of understanding. It's something that I think that resonates with another project. I'm really looking into what is happening over there. It's a project created by the researcher Sara in Canada. This project is called Crossing Fonts. And what she wants to do there is something that you are actually pointing out, Sara, is assume that there's a sort of tradition of archival neutrality and that the metadata is not important. And she is, in a way, cross-pollinating concepts, Asian policies, to how to create metadata. In this way, she's building a sort of participatory platform in which different communities are able to rewrite metadata about specific archives and images that are related to a personal tradition. And I think that is a strategy in which we can figure out ways of working in this asymmetry of powers. It's not just the big tech companies, the ones that are able to affect meta, to affect search, to make more present this rather than that. There are exercises close to contemporary art, critical theory, that really are working like in the hardware and in the software based ways of understanding the world from a cultural institution. I think that is something that is happening too. This fragmentary assemblage attention disorder way of understanding make us able to affect metadata directly or remember things that have been institutionally created to dememorialize.
I think in closing, I would love to say that also in going back to the conference that I started with, because Noam Segal, who's the new curator of media art at the Guggenheim, said it so eloquently and that is, and something that we often forget, how the fragility of AI and kind of systems, they are absolutely human-centric. So without human input, there would be systems collapse. The system will collapse and can collapse. And I think that we often forget that this is all about human-machine relationships, and that because we outnumber corporations as a society, we absolutely have the power to dismantle, change, and transform these technologies if we wanted to. So I think it's really important to go back to the human element of this. It's always been about the human, but we often feel disempowered or overwhelmed by the power of corporations and machines, and yet not realizing that we're ultimately its biggest contributors as a whole.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for listening and staying tuned for our podcast Header Footer Presents. This was Constanza Salazar, your host, and with Julio and Sara Garzón as well. Thank you, and until next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Header Footer Gallery and this podcast are part of the New Media Caucus, an international nonprofit association formed to promote the development and understanding of new media art. We represent and serve artists, designers, practitioners, historians, theorists, educators, students, and scholars. Recognizing new media art to be inherently interdisciplinary, multimodal, and evolving, we support and advance a wide range of inquiry to catalyze further evolution in the field. The New Media Caucus is committed to extending and sustaining the diversity of our community, board, and membership, to promote an environment of equality, inclusion, and respect for difference. We prioritize inclusion as an ongoing collaborative process of growth that we continually address, both within the caucus and in our field.